All right, so welcome. Thanks for those of you who are attending or taking the time to watch. I appreciate it. Welcome to our workshop on May It Please the Court. This is a new workshop that I'm very excited to initiate. It's focused on exploring the interaction between the U.S. Supreme Court and federal, state, and/or local policy and political institutions, actors, and behaviors. The live workshop's held on Tuesdays from 8 to 8:30, so you're welcome to join in. And note that the way it's structured is it'll be presentation, and then the discussion portion is not recorded. So the participants who are attending live will be able to ask questions and engage in a dialogue for anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes, depending on how long the presentation goes. So our schedule for the fall is the following. So we obviously meet every Tuesday from 8 to 8:30. The first week, this week, we'll cover an overview of the federal judiciary. And then next week, we'll look at the Supreme Court in more detail, examining its membership, docket, cases, amicus curiae briefs, and oral arguments. And then what we'll do for the next 3 weeks, so weeks 3, 4, and 5, is we'll examine a particular case, and we'll start with a mind map to kind of break down the case and its components, and then we'll start listening to an oral argument. The oral argument is what's presented before the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. Those oral arguments range for about 60 to 90 minutes. So we'll watch the first 15 minutes or so on the first week, and then the full 30 minutes the second week, and then the last part of it the third and final week. And then we'll have a discussion about the case. And we'll do that twice. So there'll be 2 cases that we listen to over the course of this 8-week workshop and discuss. All right, so let's go ahead and jump right in. So week 1, an overview of the federal judiciary. And let me see if I can zoom in just a little bit here. Make the screen a little larger. Okay. So our learning objectives with this workshop are the following. First is explain the role and the structure of the courts. Secondly is to define the Judicial Conference of the United States. And then lastly is to describe at least one difference between the federal courts and the state courts. So when it comes to this, the court's role and structure, right, it's important to note that the federal judiciary is one of 3 branches of the U.S. federal government, and it operates separately from the executive and legislative branches. But note that it works in concert with those 2 other branches when the Constitution requires. Note that federal laws are passed by the Congress and signed by the president, and the judicial branch is responsible for deciding the constitutionality of federal laws and resolves other disputes about federal laws. However, judges depend on our government's executive branch to enforce those decisions. And this is a really important concept. When you think of the 3-branch system of our government, know that the court can decide the constitutionality of something, but it's up to the executive branch to enforce the decision of the court itself. So it creates a dependence between the 2 branches there. Next, the courts decide what really happened and how and what should be done about it. They decide whether a person committed a crime and what is punishable, what the punishment should be. They also provide a peaceful way to decide private disputes that people can't resolve between themselves. And depending on the dispute or crime, some cases end up in the federal courts and some end up in state courts. Now, if you're interested in learning more about the different types of federal courts, I encourage you to check out uscourts.gov. And here you'll see an examination of the court's role and structure. One thing I do like to point out here is that there's a range of resources and a range of different types of federal courts, right? So we have the Supreme Court, which we'll talk about more next week, the Court of Appeals, which is the appellate level, the district courts, which are the ones geographically distributed across the country, bankruptcy courts, and then Article I courts, for example, related to veterans claims, appeals for the armed forces, and tax court. So you're more than welcome to check those out. And there's a cool short video here about the U.S. Court of Appeals, trying to get an insider's look of it. So I encourage you to check out that video if you get a chance. Next is the Judicial Conference. Now, I like to share the Judicial Conference because when I was studying American Government Community College, I wasn't aware of this. And then when I went to the university, I wasn't aware of this. And I wasn't aware of it until I started doing my work at the PhD program at UC Merced, and took a class on the course with Professor Tom Hansford, who's an expert in judicial politics in the Supreme Court. And I learned about the Judicial Conference. I'm like, what's this all about? So then I started digging in more and learning more about it. I was like, oh, wow. So the Judicial Conference is led by the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And the membership of the conference is comprised of the chief judge of each judicial circuit, which there are 12 of them, and the chief judge of the Court on International Trade, and a district judge from each of the regional judicial circuits, so 12 different district judges. The conference operates through a network of committees created to address and advise on a wide variety of subjects such as information technology, personnel, probation and pretrial services, space and facilities, security, judicial salaries and benefits, budget, defender services, court administration, and rules of practice and procedure. And let me go ahead and open up this link about the Judicial Conference so we can take a little bit closer look at their website. Note that in its essence is the national policymaking body for the federal courts. And what's really fascinating is that they have this set of committees, which I referenced earlier, basically helping them manage their internal affairs. And so I was really fascinated that they're organized in such a way to really govern themselves. I didn't know this, right? When I think of like committees, I think of Congress, right? I think of them hearing legislative bills, having hearings, amending the language, going to the floor, like going through the whole legislative process. Think of the president, signing a bill into law and then having to execute it or implement it. I just never thought that the courts would have some kind of similar governance structure. So as you can see here of their list of committees, they have things like audits and administrative office accountability, budget, codes of conduct, federal state jurisdiction, inter-circuit assignments, judicial resources, and then when it comes to rules of practice and procedure, the different advisory committees for the different types of courts or segments, so appellate rules, bankruptcy, and the like. So a very sophisticated, well-developed bureaucracy that helps manage the judicial plan. One thing that the conference does develop is the strategic plan for the federal judiciary. So I'll go ahead and open up this link here. And note that the strategic plan basically sets out what its goals, parameters, issues are that they're going to be working on for the next 3 to 5 or 7 years. And just gives you a really good sense of what they're doing. And go ahead and open up the link so you can take a closer look, and we'll examine the table of contents for a moment. So here's your strategic plan. The core values of the courts, right? The rule of law, equal justice, judicial independence, diversity and respect, accountability, excellence, and service. When you look at the strategic issues that they're going to be focusing on, providing justice, preserving public trust and confidence and understanding, effective and efficient management of public resources, the workforce in the workplace, harnessing technology, enhancing access to justice and the judicial process, and then the relationships between the judiciary and the other branches of government. So you just get a real healthy sense that the court's thinking of itself in a very sophisticated way as an entity. It has the internal governance structure to work, and it basically helps it maintain an equal footing with the other branches, which have very sophisticated internal governance policies and procedures, and very sophisticated ways of shaping policy. And in this case, the judicial branch is shaping the way it works so that it can then rule on those questions of is a state law constitutional, or is a state constitutional clause federally constitution with the federal constitution. As a federal law passed by the Congress and signed by the president, is that constitutional, right? Are there questions about the Constitution itself that have to be reconciled? And so the court having to do all that heavy lifting, obviously they're going to need a strong internal administration to make things work for themselves. So that gives you a sense of the judicial conference. Now, when it comes to the federal court system, know that there's basically this schematic here helps us kind of take a look at it in more detail. So note that there's a difference between trial courts and appeals courts. Trial courts are like the initial place that someone who's a plaintiff or defendant or litigant is going to go and state their case before the judicial branch. So when you think of trial courts, there's a U.S. tax court. There's also the U.S. district courts, which there are 94 of them, including the 3 territories across all 50 states. We have the U.S. Court of International Trade, U.S. Court of Federal Claims, and then courts martials when it comes to the armed services. And then we have appeals courts. These are the second and third level courts that if someone who loses in the trial court, they can appeal to these second and third level courts saying, hey, I lost, but I want to appeal that loss. I want to either look at process, I want to either look at substance, or I want to look at both. And I want the appeals court to take a close eye on it. So the most common ones we hear about are the U.S. Courts of Appeals here, and there's 12 geographic circuits, which I'll show a map in a moment. We have the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. This is based in Washington, D.C., and they deal exclusively with matters of the federal government amongst the federal government. And then you have the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces. Now, you might be asking, okay, so where's the Supreme Court in all of this? Well, the Supreme Court is the last appellate court. It's not the first unless it's an issue of a particular type of jurisdiction. But just know that, say you bring a case to a district court in, let's say, the Eastern District of California, and you lose, well, then you can appeal it to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is based in the Western United States. And say you win that, well, the person who then lost, they can appeal it to the Supreme Court. And then it's up to the Supreme Court to decide if they're going to hear your case. So just know that we have a robust judicial system of both trial and appeals courts. Next, I'd like to show you the geographic boundaries of the district courts, which is a little harder to see here, but also of the appeals courts jurisdiction. So I'm going to zoom in just a little bit so you get a sense of it. So here you'll see that the First Circuit Court of Appeals is amongst the states of Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. The Ninth Circuit, this yellow shaded area, includes Hawaii, Guam, Northern Marianas, Alaska, and then the Western states, Arizona, Nevada, Idaho, Montana, Washington, Oregon, and California. Now, if you look a little closer, you see these dashed lines, and it's easiest to see it in California. But in California, nested within the state are 4 district courts or trial courts. So depending on where you live and where the case you want to bring it forward, you can bring it in one of those 4 districts in California and say you win. So the person you beat, they're going to appeal it to the Ninth Circuit. And depending on how things go, then it would go to the Supreme Court. So there's this geographic element to how the judiciary is structured. So just keep that in mind as we are thinking about the federal courts and once we get to the Supreme Court next week. Now, this last part is comparing the federal and state courts. And let me go ahead and open this link. When you think of the court system, most of the times it's kind of hard to say, I'm going to take you to court. Well, the question is, which court are you going to take me to? You're going to take me to federal court, you're going to take me to state court. Now, there's reasons why one person would go to a federal court versus state court. So I just kind of want to walk through some of these different court structures between the federal and the state. So at the federal level, it's within Article 3 of the Constitution, invests the judicial power of the United States in a federal court system. Article 3, Section 1 specifically creates the U.S. Supreme Court and then gives Congress the authority to create the lower federal courts. As a contrast, the state court system, the Constitution and laws of each state establish the state courts. A court of last resort, often also known as the Supreme Court, is usually the highest court in a given state. Some states also have an intermediate court of appeals. Below these appeals courts are state trial courts. Some are referred to as circuit or district courts. Now, when it comes to federal courts, Congress has used this power to establish 13 U.S. Court of Appeals, 94 district courts, courts of claims, and the like. And at the state level, states also usually have courts that handle specific legal matters. So things like probate, which are about wills and estates. So these are the documents after you pass away, what happens to all the money or property or other things you've left behind. Juvenile courts, family courts, etc. At the federal level, parties dissatisfied with the decision of the U.S. District Court and the Court of Claims and or the Court of International Trade can appeal it to one of the U.S. Court of Appeals. Now, at the state level, parties dissatisfied with a decision of the trial court may take their case to an intermediate court of appeals within their state. When it comes to the federal courts, a party may ask the U.S. Supreme Court to review a decision of a U.S. Court of Appeals, but the Supreme Court usually is under no obligation, right? So the Supreme Court gets to decide what cases it will hear. And in other words, and in addition to that, the U.S. Supreme Court is the final arbiter of federal constitutional questions. If the Supreme Court decides not to hear a case, it's basically saying whatever the appeals court decided, that's going to be the answer to a federal constitutional question. At the state level, parties have the option to ask the highest court to hear their case. And note that some state cases are eligible for review by the U.S. Supreme Court. So sometimes the state process will exhaust itself. You can't then say, oh, I don't like how the state Supreme Court decided, so I'm going to go to a federal court. That can only happen in particular instances, especially particularly when it interacts with federal constitutional questions or federal legal questions. So if you check out the rest of that website, you'll see like how they select judges, which varies, and then the types of cases that are heard. So all in all, a comparison of the federal courts and the state courts is rather dynamic. And it's important to know that there are two court systems. There's one in the state that you live in, and then there's one for the entire country. But that one for the entire country is divided by geography, starting with states, then groups of states as the courts of appeals, and then finally the Supreme Court. Okay. So with that, we'll go ahead and transition to our discussion. Before we do, I want to just point out that there are several additional resources that I point you to. One is called Understanding the Federal Courts. The second is the Federal Judicial Center. And then lastly is my dissertation. So this is the book length manuscript that I wrote in order to get my PhD. And I like sharing this because obviously I'm very proud. It took a lot of time to write. And I'll go ahead and have the computer read the abstract to you so you just get a sense of what I did my research on and what I have an expertise in. So let me go ahead and have this play out loud for us.
How does Congress structure the judiciary, specifically the organization of the lower district courts? Since 1789, Congress has allocated at least 84 judicial districts, 686 judicial seats, 533 judicial meeting places, and 604 judicial courthouses to the lower courts. While previous scholarship has examined instances when district court seats are created, we still know very little about the structuring of the district courts by Congress. By combining insights from both the judicial politics and distributive politics literatures, I argue that Congress allocates districts, seats, meeting places, and courthouses as a means of providing pork to member states. I develop a theory of the allocation of judicial pork, where I argue that Congress allocates judicial institutions similarly to traditional pork, like bridges and highways. Specifically, I contend that states with representation on the Judiciary committees in the Senate and House of Representatives are more likely to be allocated judicial pork than states without such representation. Using newly collected data gathered from the Federal Judiciary Center, I test my theory using observational data from 1813 to 2014 in 4 case studies. In line with my expectations, I find evidence that suggests rank-and-file representation on the Senate and House Judiciary committees positively affects the allocation of judicial pork.
So there's the abstract. If you want to read more, you can visit judicialpork.org or .com. I had to double check if I have both. I think it's .com. Yeah. So that's the short URL, direct you to the publicly available dissertation. So with that, we'll go ahead and shift over to our discussion. Thanks for taking the time to listen in and have a good day.